My name is Patrick Kern, and along with my 10-dimensional friend Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, Greg and I discuss Cattell's data box and try to better understand what it is not, and how we might make use of this in practice. Along the way, we also discuss illegal knives, baseball cards, the Cubs and the Mariners, bicentennial quarters, how to load a dishwasher, horrible people, anal retentive friends, flat Stanley, Dungeons and Dragons, pricing yourself out of business, needing 20 friends, being super pedantic, the full Monty, stereograms, and magical statistical accessories. We hope you enjoy this week's episode.
I got a question for you. Did you collect stuff as a kid? Maybe you collect stuff as a grown-up.
I do collect stuff as a grown-up, and it's very, very strange, and it drives my wife crazy to no end. I make Christmas presents and birthday presents to my kids various forms of knives, and we jointly collect knives.
Huh.
I will say that not all, using air quotes, are legal.
Happy birthday, sweetheart.
Oh, thank you. Dad.
Okay, pop quiz. What's the proper name for one of those?
Easy Balathong. It's Filipino.
Excellent, good.
Now, for you probably collected things like toothbrushes and lined them up by size.
Okay, no matter what crap you're about to give me, let's start with you collect knives and make your kids collect knives. Okay,
Point taken.
I tried collecting coins, and I amassed this really cool collection of bicentennial coins. Mm-hmm. So for those who don't know, back in 1976, we had a bicentennial.
It was, of course, on July 4th, 1976, that most of the celebrating took place, with parades of square-rigged sailing ships, each over 200 feet in length, streaming past the Statue of Liberty and massive fireworks.
So they issued all of these special bicentennial coins, and our house got broken into, and someone stole all of my coins. It was very, very sad.
That bastard.
I know.
I collected bicentennial quarters. I had them into adulthood, and I had them in a little box on my dresser. Mm-hmm. I have none anymore because a kid would lose a tooth. We would need a tooth fairy gift, and we didn't have a coin in the house. I told my wife the first time, all right, once and only once are we doing this. And yeah, we did it every single time. So I think I have one bicentennial quarter left.
My brother is a collector, and the best way to summarize what he collects is imagine him delivering a pickup line. Hey, I bring home 6 figures a month. But they're Star Wars action figures.
New Star Wars action figures and playsets for ages 6 and up. Way up!
But I had this friend who was totally into baseball card collecting. I was not into baseball card collections at all. Did you collect those?
No, I didn't discover baseball till later in life. We didn't have cable TV, and it wasn't until I was in my 20s that we got WGN, and I would watch Cubs in the afternoon.
Hello again, everybody. Harry Carey and Steve Stone were at Wrigley Field for the final home game of the year.
Yeah, same here. We didn't get the Seattle Mariners until I was a bit older. But I had this friend who had an amazing, religious baseball card collection, and it had taken over his room. And I have this one very specific memory that on the wall opposite his bed, he had a pile for each of the players that he was interested in collecting. There would be on top for a given player a rookie card, and then going across on the card were all of the different statistics, like batting average, a number of doubles and triples and home runs and all of that stuff. And then behind the rookie card was then year 2, and behind that was year 3, and behind that was year 4. So for all of the consecutive years, there was a stack of cards for a given player. And then running the full length of his wall, he had all the players that he cared about. So there might have been a Pete Rose stack, there might have been a Johnny Bench stack, all the way going along the whole wall. He wouldn't even let his mom vacuum his bedroom because no one got near the baseball cards. But I really appreciated the layout and the meticulousness of this arrangement.
So I have two thoughts. First, it does not come as a shock to any of us that you had an anal retentive friend who liked to organize things and got freaked out if anybody moved it. So, folks, I've spent a lot of time at Greg's house, and he has a dishwasher where the very top rack pulls out, and it's where you put the silverware. And not only is the silverware put in piece by piece in the little slots, but the spoons go together and the forks go together. And when his back is turned, I will switch a spoon and a fork, and then I'll go sit at the table, and he'll pull it out, and he'll look at it, and his face will crease, and he'll switch them back. So that comes as a shock to no one.
Hello, and welcome to the Anal Retentive Chef. I've already cut up my bell pepper. Look at this. Isn't this nice? See how all the pieces are the same size?
But the second point is your setup is going to pivot us into what we're going to talk about today. It's kind of fun to think about, and it's a thing called the data box. It's named after a person. It's Cattell's data box, a guy named Raymond Cattell, and we're going to have to talk about him a little bit before we get into it. But what it is a way of mentally organizing the way that we design and gather and analyze data. Because of the historical developments of it, it was a very long time ago. I mean, in the 40s, he started writing about this, but just updating people on what it is and where that comes from. So that's the topic today, is Cattell's data box. Now, unfortunately, we have to take a bit of a walk down memory lane. We are keeping a scorecard of horrible people and not horrible people. Unfortunately, the first list tends to be longer than the second list. Dr. Raymond Cattell falls on the horrible person list. He was very much in the writing and advocating of eugenics. If you read his actual words that he wrote himself, he unambiguously was advocating for these kinds of things.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt? Yeah, I just want to say that you are a horrible, horrible person.
Very briefly, he worked in the 30s, 40s, all the way into the 80s. He was at Columbia, and he went to Harvard, and he was at the University of Hawaii. He mostly did multivariate work in temperament, personality, intelligence. He's actually a native of England. He has hundreds of papers, dozens of books. In 1997, the American Psychological Association voted to give him what's called the Gold Medal for lifetime achievements. I was actually in the blast radius of this because I was a brand new, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed assistant professor, and I was at the APA conference. 2 days before the conference, some people had unearthed this eugenics writing. They demanded the award be retracted. 48 hours before the ceremony, APA decided not to give the award. We're going to talk about something from a smart guy who made a lot of contributions, who is a horrible human being, and we just have to remember that.
I think this is another example of trying to separate some of the ideas that are influential and very useful from the person who has generated them. And he had some really good ideas, I think, in terms of how to think about things more comprehensively. And one of the themes that you and I have talked about a lot is that our field isn't just this collection of methods that are sitting all over the place, but they're really integrated. And one of the nice things that he was talking about was thinking about it all the way at the data level, about how all of these things really fit together.
He certainly was a vocal advocate for multivariate techniques, that if we're going to learn about complicated things in a complicated world, we had to get a comprehensive measurement and analytic framework to try to come to an accurate understanding about that. And that's actually exactly what we're going to talk about today. So almost all of us, when we think about a data frame, right, how do we organize our data? So think about Greg's anal retentive friend with the baseball cards. We can think about it in two dimensions. We almost always do this. It's an N by P data matrix. So remember, in matrix notation, the first element refers to rows and the second element refers to columns. N refers to individuals and P refers to variables. we think about an N by P data matrix. If you live in the quant world, you already can envision that. If you don't, if you're out in the business world or you're just driving because your spouse is listening to this never-ending nonsense, think about it as an Excel spreadsheet. As you have rows and columns, each cell contains a little piece of information. The vast majority of what we do is based on something like that. It's two-dimensional. Remember Flat Stanley?
I do.
Okay. So this is Flat Stanley. What we're going to do is we're going to let Flat Stanley be not flat, all right? I want to pan back now, and obviously I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
I mean, obviously that's where the pivot goes, right?
You can talk about my friends being anal retentive all you want. You're bringing up Dungeons and Dragons. All right, go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's kind of funny. In my entire life, I played one game of Dungeons and Dragons. One. I was in high school. There was a group who invited me to join. It was my very first time. And by blind luck, I got some powerful thing. I don't know, a wand or something. And the guy next to me was annoying me. The dungeon master said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I turned to my right and cast a spell on David." I was just messing around. The dungeon master said, "A spell is cast," and he rolled a dice and said, "David's character is dead." This was a character he had been developing for like 2 years, and he almost cried and stormed home, and I was never invited back. However, I have a kid, Jay, who is very much into Dungeons and Dragons and loves it. They're actually a dungeon master, and they write the stories, and they do all of that, and I love it, and I love hearing about it. My favorite part are the dice. If anybody is a D&D player out there, if you want to lose several hours of your time as well as about $50, go on Etsy and search for D&D dice, and there's this entire market of custom-made D&D dice that you can get. I'm going to get one of these custom D&D dice, and picture in your mind's eye, it's a translucent cube.
Ooh, fancy.
You can see through it, but inside the cube, you can see a number. Doesn't matter what it is, 3.8. That is a numerical value inside this translucent cube. Now, what Cattell argued, that single numerical value actually contains information about 10 dimensions.
Wow.
So think about Flat Stanley. Think about Greg's anal retentive friend. Think about Greg's forks and spoons.
Forks go with forks, okay?
No, I am aware of that. We have met.
Sorry.
That single numerical value is one instance of a 10-dimensional space. In his writings, he talked about 5 essential dimensions. And these were the individual and the response. And that's our N by P, right? That's what we usually think about. But then he talked about there's a focal stimulus. Now, he was an old school experimental psychologist, so maybe you have condition A, condition B. There's a focal stimulus. There's what he called a non-focal stimulus or a background. Are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you anxious? Right? So there's some condition that maybe isn't controlled by the experimental design. There's observer. Is it the individual? Is it an external observer? We just had a prior episode about inter-rater reliability, so there's an observer. And then he had one and then later dropped it of the scale. So is that numerical value ordinal or a count or a continuous? But he, in later writings, said that was less relevant and he dropped that. So there are 5: person, response, focal stimulus, background, and observer. And then each of those can be crossed with time and with context, which he differed from the stimulus. You really got to dive into the reading if you want to know the details. But there are 10 dimensions, and he's spot on with every one, right? What's the time point? What is the observer? What is the condition? Was it in a classroom? Did you manipulate an experimental design? And he originally called this the Basic Data Relation Matrix, or the BDRM. And this was kind of the first major ball he hit into play of a 10-dimensional organizational structure for any given numerical value that we have obtained.
So he had 5 dimensions that he scaled up to 10, but I still can't visualize all of that. So how did he bring that to us in a way that we can actually deal with?
Well, just to clarify, I don't think Stephen Hawking could visualize that single die representing a 10-dimensional space.
I tried to visualize it, but I could not. To be fair, it might have something to do with the fact that I am dead.
He noted, rarely if ever is this used in its full form because it's 10-dimensional, and the term that I liked when I read this is he said, the BDRM priced itself out of business because of its complexity. And I like that, you price yourself out of business. What he did is he did 2 things. The first is he said, if you can, you gotta hang on to the floating door after the Titanic shifts, even though there's room for 2 people.
Yes, clearly, it's been demonstrated.
You hang on to that floating door with the 10 dimensions.
I'll never let go. I promise.
Because, and this is the really important thing, all right, of why it exists and why we're talking about it now, that it forces us to think about these dimensions of complexity when we're working with theory formulation, hypothesis generation, data management, and then where the rubber hits the road, model fitting. If you have to think about a 10-dimensional space, then it forces you to be more concise, to be more precise, to be better organized in, well, what do you mean that there's a relation between X and Y? Right? Where in that 10-dimensional space is that relation between X and Y? Early on, he himself saw the 10 dimensions were ludicrous, and he distilled it down to 3 so that people like you and me could actually figure it out.
It's the forks, it's the spoons, it's the knives.
It all goes back to the forks and spoons.
Even though they're different size forks, which should be together.
And they are, folks. I can attest to that.
Damn right they are.
He distilled it down to 3. Object, attribute, and circumstance. Now, those are generic terms. Object, we all study a lot of different things. A lot of us study people, but you may have an instance when you're studying individual animals. You may have crime reporting areas. You may have level of the country, whatever it might be, the object, but that's typically person. The attribute is the variable. That's that numerical value that is inside that translucent cube. Are you measuring anxiety? Are you measuring depression? Is it a measure of, did you get item 11 on a test right? So that's the observation. And then the circumstance is where things get really cool. Because a lot of times when people talk about Cattell's data box, they immediately go to the 3rd dimension of time. Picture N by P flat Stanley. N are people, P are variables. The depth of the box is time.
Ooh.
You have 1 row of cubes are time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, but they could be classroom. They could be experimental condition. They could be, was the child assessed in the family home or was the child assessed at school? So it's very general, but we now have a 3-dimensional cube where people run down the rows, variables run across the columns, and then when we move to 3-dimensional depth, that's either time or context.
Okay, so I'm going to anchor this in 2 ways to try to help my brain get around it. One is my buddy's bedroom, and this may or may not be useful for anybody, but the way I think about it then is along his wall, you have different players. So each stack of cards is like a row, a different player, and going across each card is going to be the different variables that we have, like runs batted in and batting average and number of triples and home runs. And then if each top card is the rookie card, and behind that card in the stack is then the second year, and behind that card in the stack is the third year. That is like this 3-dimensional thing that you're talking about. You gave a great example for the poor partner who is riding in the car, being subject to...
Yeah, we apologize on behalf of Quantitude to the spouse who at this moment is listening to this in the passenger seat. We are sorry.
Yeah, you're really taking one for the team. So,
or the kids, right? That's even more.
That's abusive. Okay. You mentioned the Excel spreadsheet, which I like a lot. I have going down the left side, the objects, as you called them, the individuals, and they could be countries or people. Going across is going to be the variables or attributes, as they were historically called. Now we have different sheets, right? I'm just trained to think in terms of the two dimensions of the spreadsheet, but there's another sheet that follows, which is a second time or a second context. And then there's a third sheet, which is a third time or context, etc. So if I think about all of these Excel spreadsheets stacked on top of each other, I have a mental model for this data box that you're talking about full of translucent 10-dimensional cubes.
Exactly. Let's go super simple, if for nothing else than me and you.
Okay.
Let's say we gather together all of the friends that you and I have, and then we add 18 more people, so there are 20 of us at the table. All right? So there are 20 of us at the table. And each of us, in front of us, has our own pile of these D&D die.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to be super pedantic because that's the only way I understand anything. Each of us takes one cube that has in the middle of it some numerical value. And let's say we stack that in a single column. So everybody just picture one tower of these 20 translucent cubes. Mm-hmm. In matrix terms, that's a column vector. Mm-hmm. Well, that will allow us to get a mean of those 20 observations and a variance. Mm-hmm. And then we're done, right? There's nothing else. If we wanted to go to town, we could get a skewness and a kurtosis. We don't care. It's just a univariate distribution for a mean and a variance. Mm-hmm. Now, everybody reaches into their pile and takes a second cube, and we're going to stack it to the right of that first tower. Mm-hmm. And we're going to build up another tower right next to it. Now it's a matrix. We have the same n going down the rows, but now we have two columns. There's y1 and there's y2. What does that give us? A mean and a variance of y1, a mean and a variance of y2, but we can now get a covariance between y1 and y2. We now can look at a bivariate distribution. We haven't done anything new here with the box yet, right? Mm-hmm. This is just now a data matrix. We could do it for y3, y4, y5. Go out y10. So we have 20 rows, 10 columns. That's business as usual for us, right? We haven't done anything new.
Right.
That's just a 20 by 10 data matrix. We can pretty much do everything that we like to with the general linear model. We can get a correlation matrix. If you have enough people, we could do a factor analysis. We could do a regression, whatever. That's our usual data matrix. But here's what's kind of fun. Let's go back to that single tower on Y1. Mm-hmm. But let's put a column behind it, not next to it, but behind it. And let's call that third dimension time. So we have Y1 on 20 people. We have two columns, but one is behind it. Well, that's a pre-test, post-test.
Yeah.
On variable y1.
Okay, so to torture this metaphor, that single column that you had would be like the top card is the rookie year for all of these players, and the first column on that card might be, let's say, their batting average. So you've got this tower of cubes that are all these rookie baseball players' batting averages. When you go over to the right and construct another column, it might be the number of home runs that they hit. If instead you go back, which in my buddy's room would be the next card in each pile to the second year, then you have rookie year batting average and then second year batting average, which is kind of like test retest.
It can be a test retest. It could be a pre-post if that was the design. Mm-hmm. Say you're a cognitive psychologist and it could be the reaction time when there is not a distractor in the room, but the second column is the reaction time if there is a distractor in the room. This can be anything we want it to be, but now we did one tower to the right and we did one tower behind. Well, now it's very easy to do the full Monty.
We're here, we're live, and for one night only, we're going for the full Monty.
Imagine that we have 20 people and we have 10 variables. We have 20 rows for each person. We have 10 columns that go across the front, but now we just add a row of cubes behind it for time 2, time 3, time 4, time 5. Let's just focus on time, making things easy, and just know that it could be condition, it could be classroom, it could be environment. The one I like is it could be reporter. Maybe there's a mom reports on a child behavior, a dad reports on a child behavior, and a teacher reports on a child behavior. Well, those are 3 deep into the box. Because one wall of translucent cubes is mom report, the one behind it is dad, the one behind that is teacher. So this scales up and down. We're just going to call it time. So what we've got now in the middle of the table is 3 dimensions. And when we pick a given cube out, that is for a person on a variable at a given time point. Why do we do this? Well, it's an organizing framework. I'll read a quote from Cattell. He's a very good writer. We mentioned he's a horrible human being, but he's a very good writer. What he wrote is, it becomes eventually clear that a theory is inevitably constructed out of a set of relationships. However metaphorical or cloudy or verbally bound a theory may be in its first visit to the experimenter's mind, it must eventually have its precise statements only in the flesh and blood of actual data relationships. When these relations are systematically kept in view, one finds that most experimenters notice and operate upon only a small and arbitrary selection from the total system of relational possibilities necessary to defining or proving their choices. So this is an organizing structure for theory, hypotheses, data management, and data analysis.
Right. And it gives you a sense of the limits of your own generalizability, because if I'm only looking at one slice in time, that's like only looking at the rookie season of those cards, then the question is, well, does this hold across all of these other conditions? We have this habit of taking this beautiful data box that you're describing from Cattell's BDSM or whatever. Something. Probably wasn't BDSM.
It was not. You were close. BDRM.
Okay.
The basic data relation matrix.
Excellent. Okay. I think BDSM is something entirely different. But we often will just focus on 2 dimensions of it at a time. And that's how I first encountered this, was really just in terms of how we often slice this to get at particular questions.
And that's a great term, slice. Have you ever seen one of them fancy cakes where if you cut it one way, the side is one, and you cut it another way, the side is another? It's kind of like that. And Cattell literally talked about it like that. The slice he referred to as a facet. So imagine we've got that cube in front of us at the table. Every friend Greg and I have in the world, plus 18 other people, so there are 20 of us there. We take a special D&D knife and we just cut the face off of that box. That is our N by P data matrix. That is people by persons. Now, here's the thing that Cattell was pushing. If that's what you're operating with in your own work, which a lot of us do, that's just one slice from that fancy pants cake, right? You're slicing off that front facet. Well, imagine slicing the top facet. Well, what do you have? You have one person on multiple variables at multiple time points. That's a time series. Now slice the final dimension, and what you have are people that you're cutting across, but one variable on multiple time points. So we can cut these in these different directions, and it does get a little confusing. Somebody might say, well, don't do an R factor analysis, you should do a P technique. And it's like, oh yeah, absolutely, I'll do that. And then you go back to your office and Google what the hell is P technique. But when we start thinking about these things, there are 6 kinds of techniques. The first is called R technique. And what that is our usual N by P data matrix. If somebody talks about an R technique or an R factor analysis, you have people by variables and you're doing a factor analysis. Maybe it's an EFA, maybe it's a CFA, doesn't matter. The second one, though, is the P technique. And what that is when we slice the top off. And that is we have one person, multiple variables, multiple time points. This is sometimes called a dynamic factor analysis or a within-person factor analysis. And those are really the two biggies, the R technique and the P technique. There are four others, though, just because we're congenital counters. The Q technique, and this is really cool, is the transpose of the R technique.
Right.
And so instead of having people by variables, we factor variables by people. And you say, well, who the hell would ever do that? Well, those are classification methods, cluster analysis, latent profile analysis, things like that. So that's the Q technique.
And that's all in that first facet. When you slice off the top instead, you have a single subject design. And a P technique is grouping the variables across time or across occasions. And an O technique is turning your head sideways and grouping the time or occasions across the variables that you have. And then the one that we probably do the least is when we slice the side, only focusing on a single variable. When we do that, you are going across time or across people. So do I want to group time across people, which is a T technique? Or do I want to group people across time, which is an S technique? So each one of these is taking a facet that you have and deciding whether you want to look at it up and down or side to side. And that defines these 6 different analyses, O, P, Q, R, S, and T. And P, Q, and R are probably the most common ones that people tend to think about.
And when you think about it in this way, these transposes I find really interesting. R is we're clustering variables across people. Q is the transpose of that, where we're clustering people across variables.
Yep.
And to this day, I hear people say, I would never do a factor analysis. I am going to do a latent profile analysis. Well, I got to tell you, look at that stack of D&D cubes and just turn your head 90 degrees.
Yep.
And you just went from EFA to LPA. And in evidence of that, a remarkable guy named Gibson in the 50s mathematically proved that for a given data set, R and Q technique, meaning EFA and latent profile analysis, are numerically equivalent if EFA has one dimension more than the LPA. So when people start flexing in front of a mirror and say they would never do a variable-centered analysis, they're going to do a person-centered, they're the same damn thing.
As are any of these things within their facets, right? Whether it's the front facet, the top facet, or the side facet.
Now, here's what's really cool. We've got the concept, but now we can start playing around with it, all right? Our data box that's sitting in front of us, everything that we've talked about, it's fully solid. There's a translucent D&D cube for every column, row, and depth.
Yep.
Okay, well, take your D&D little selector magnet and start pulling out individual cubes. All right, so it's kind of honeycombed throughout. That's missing data.
Right.
Maybe it's missing by attrition. Maybe it's planned missing. Here's a mind-blowing one. Imagine that we have 3 data boxes that are completely separate. All right, and they could be different dimensions. They could have different rows, different columns, different depth. But we want to somehow put those together. That's integrative data analysis.
Nice.
Right? Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Did you ever do those pictures where they're all like modeled and you got to stare at it and then all of a sudden, like after a minute, you would see the 3-dimensional dinosaur?
I became obsessed with those. Sometimes they were called stereograms, and you literally just stared at them until you got this moment of clarity. You're like, where the hell did that dinosaur come from?
Right. And I was a congenital liar, and I don't think I saw one once, but I'd be like, after 2 minutes, oh my God, that's incredible. And I couldn't see anything. This is kind of like seeing that three-dimensional dinosaur. When you start thinking about this, if you're combining multiple independent data sets and each of these maybe are a facet, right? You can think about that as integrative data analysis. But what if you have different top facets? Maybe you cut off the top. Well, what is that? That's an n of 1.
Right.
There's a single row. You have multiple variables and multiple time points or contexts or whatever it is. There's a big field of study on individual participant meta-analysis. So you fit a dynamic factor analysis for person 1. That's that top facet. You fit a dynamic factor analysis for person 2 and 3 and 4, which are these single layers of cubes on the table. And then you do a meta-analysis to put those together for an individual participant data meta-analysis. Well, those are just different facets of the same data box.
It also reminds me of how limited our brains are sometimes, right? Because we talk, for example, about, are your data in long format or are they in wide format? And it's because we're limited in the way that we input our data and analyze our data. When we have our data in long format, it is like taking all of the layers behind each person and just putting them underneath for each person until we exhaust it and then continuing down. Wide format, we just take all of that stuff, right? And we take the layer behind and we set it next to, like putting all of your Excel spreadsheets right next to each other. So we often have to try to distill this down to something in 2 dimensions to be able to get our head around it or to be able to get our software around it. But I'll tell you, I much prefer thinking about it exactly as you're describing. It's a very useful way for putting all of these things in one place.
In the rare instance that we actually have a point, is if somebody talks about a data box, a data cube, a P technique or an R technique or a Q technique, it is to this that they are referring. This we suggest you keep in the back of your mind simply as an organizing framework. I feel like in our field, we excessively worship a numerical value. That we get a 3.8 and we say it's a reliable and valid assessment of anxiety. Okay, that 3.8 is a numerical assessment of anxiety that contains information on 10 different dimensions. So that magical number inside that translucent cube, under what conditions was that gathered? What was the condition of the individual when they gave that response? What was the context they were in? Who gave that as a reporter? At what time point was that given? When you hold that little D&D cube, it's not going to change the numerical value inside it, but it changes the way we think about the numerical value inside it.
I'm going to have to go soon because I have to rearrange the dishwasher before I run it.
Yeah, no, we all know. Thank you, everybody. We so appreciate you joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care, everybody. And remember, little forks go together, big forks go together. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go for things that try to use 10 dimensions to help them better understand the 2 dimensions that they were completely comfortable working in. You can also follow us on X or Blue Sky and visit our webpage, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, search past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, check out our cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized Quantitude Pod merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the level 11 paladin of podcasts. And in that spirit...
Today's episode has been sponsored by the full line of Dungeons & Dragons accessories to help you in your statistical and academic life. Worried about the dreaded curse of missing data? Protect your quest from such afflictions with the Incantation of Fullest Information. This spell inflicts searing agony upon anyone who even thinks of leaving a query unanswered. And should you be ambushed by the foul demon of assumption violation? Fear not! Arm yourself with the broadsword of Stanley and don the armor of unlimited robustness. With these, your statistical defenses shall remain unbroken, and your tests will lose not a single hit point of stamina. Has the vile Reverend Bayes ensnared your model in the cycle of infinite burn-in? Call upon the mystic dice of Gelman Rubin for all your stochastic convergence needs. Even better when casting 4 dice at once. Lastly, when you stand before the elders of knowledge to offer your written work for entry into the sacred scrolls of Academe, beware the malicious troll, reviewer number 2. For such an adversary, nothing works better than a vial of the potion of extreme remorse, which compels reviewers to continuously recite the errors in their own work for an entire fortnight. Side effects include self-reflection, humility, and diarrhea. This most definitely beeth not NPR.
Dad, did you rearrange the dishwasher again?